Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this public meeting of the Standing Committee on Government Operations. I am Kieran Testart, member for Cam Lake and chair of the Standing Committee on Government Operations, and I'll allow members to introduce themselves for the record, starting with Mr. Simpson.
RJ Simpson, MLA for Haverhill North. Welcome.
Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
Good morning and welcome. My name is Corey Vanthine, MLA for Yellowknife North.
Good morning, Danny McNeely, Satu.
Good morning, Shane Thompson, Nahindi.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome, Herb Nekamak from the Nukput.
And with me, thank you, members. With me at the table are our newest permanent committee clerk, Jennifer Franki-Smith, our research advisor, April Taylor, and our law clerk, Glenn Rutland. I'd like to welcome the minister, his staff, and members of the public, including our mayor-elect, Ms. Rebecca Alty. Thank you all for joining us today. We are reviewing the City, Towns and Villages Act, and today is our public clause-by-clause review of the bill. Bill 18, sponsored by the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs, amends the Cities, Towns and Villages Act to provide municipal councils governed under the Act with new powers: the authority to impose a tax on tourist accommodations and the authority to allow property owners to finance energy efficiency or renewable energy works through local improvement charges added to the property owner's municipal tax bill. It is important to note that these new powers are separate from one another and not related, except that they are both dealt with under the Cities, Towns, and Villages Act, the legislation that sets out the powers of tax-based municipal governments. Bill 18 received second reading in the Legislative Assembly on May 29, 2018, and was referred to the Standing Committee on Government Operations for review. To commence consultation on Bill 18, the Standing Committee invited input on the bill from 99 hotel and bed and breakfast operators offering tourist accommodations in the 6 tax-based municipalities. This consultation list was kindly provided by the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs, who used the same list when consulting on the development of the bill. On behalf of the committee, I want to thank the Honourable Alfred Moses, Minister of Municipal and Community Affairs, for his willingness to collaborate with us on this work. Committee held a public hearing on Bill 18 in Yellowknife on September 19th, 2018, where we received presentations from the Yellowknife Chamber of Commerce, the City of Yellowknife, and the Explorer Hotel. Committee also met with the Mayor of Inuvik and representatives of Town Council in Inuvik on October 2nd. Finally, committee received written submissions from those who presented at the Yellowknife meeting, as well as the Town of Fort Smith, the Yellowknife Stays Inn and Suites, and Ebleton House Bed and Breakfast. Committee thanks everyone who provided input on Bill 18. As a result of committee's consultation, committee will be proposing amendments to Bill 18. The details of the submissions received by committee and the nature of committee's deliberations will be addressed in our report, which will be tabled in the Legislative Assembly next week. There are copies of the bill available at the table near the entrance. We'll now invite the Honourable Alfred Moses, Minister of Municipal and Community Affairs, to introduce himself and his staff for the record and proceed with any opening comments you may have. Mr. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members, and thank you for all the work that you've done in doing your consultation and the work around this bill. I would like to thank you for inviting me today to speak to you and the members of the committee about Bill 18, an act to amend the Cities, Towns and Villages Act. I would like to note at the onset that in addition to the 2 suites of the amendments I will present, this bill makes 3 housekeeping amendments that have been suggested by the Legislative Division of the Department of Justice. I would like to introduce my officials that are here with me today. They are here to help answer questions. They are Ms. Grace Lau, Director of Community Operations from MACA on my immediate left, Mr. Ian Rennie, Legislative Counsel, Department of Justice on my right. Seated in the gallery are Ms. Eleanor Young, my Deputy Minister of MACA, my Acting Ministerial Advisor, Belinda Bredmore, Laurie Fife, Director of Community Governments on my far left, and Ms. Trish McFall, Manager of Policy and Planning for MACA. I would also like to recognize in the gallery Mayor-elect Rebecca Alty, welcome, and SAO Sheila Bassey-Kellett from the City of Yellowknife, welcome. Mr. Chair, through its legislation and policies, the Department of MACA seeks to support capable, accountable, and self-directed community governments in carrying out their responsibilities to provide safe, sustainable, and healthy environments for residents. There are currently 6 communities established under the CTV Act: Yellowknife, Hay River, Inuvik, Fort Smith, Fort Simpson, and Norman Wells. These amendments apply only to those communities. The amendments provide tools that those community governments may use to generate revenue for tourism promotion and services in their communities, and to assist property owners in making energy-efficient retrofits and harnessing renewable energy technologies. I will introduce each suite of amendments in turn. And Mr. Chair, tourist accommodation taxes exist in some form in all provinces throughout Canada, whether in the form of a tax on hotel rooms collected by the province or a municipality, or a destination marketing fee charged by hotel and accommodation associations. In the absence of legislation and in partnership with the municipality, after consideration of each of these options and in consultation with community governments and stakeholders, we propose amendments to the CTV Act to give communities the authority to choose to impose a tourism accommodation tax. Mr. Chair, the proposed amendments will allow a municipality corporation to pass a bylaw levying a tax of up to 4% on tourist accommodation within the municipality. Revenue from the tax may also be used for tourism initiatives. The amendments also allow for revenue to be managed by a nonprofit organization under agreement with the municipality. The definition of tourist accommodation is broad, capturing any premises offering accommodation for purchase on a short-term basis. The management and administration of the tax is at the discretion of the municipal corporation. A bylaw passed by council must set out the rate of tax and outline how the tax will be collected, and may also provide an additional exemptions from the tax and address enforcement matters. The proposed tourist accommodation tax may not be collected from the government of the Northwest Territories, individuals on medical travel who are staying in hotels or other tourist accommodations, or from a person staying in accommodation for more than 30 days in a row or for less than $20 per night. These exemptions will be facilitated by the collection provisions set by the municipality in the bylaw. Reporting is at the discretion of the Minister of MACA. If existing reporting process under the Act are insufficient, the Minister may require a municipal corporation to provide further details on the revenue collected and spent. The second suite of amendments include the bill fulfills a mandate commitment for the 18th Legislative Assembly. The proposed amendments will enable the municipal corporation to use local improvement charges to assist residents in making retrofits or implementing renewable energy technology to private homes. The type of projects that could be supported through these charges include the installation of an energy-efficient furnace or pellet boiler, or the installation of solar panels. Existing provisions of the CTV Act set out a process of local improvements such as sidewalks or water mains, projects benefiting multiple properties in a particular area. The proposed amendments allow municipal corporations using a modified local improvement charge process to undertake projects on private property that benefit a single property. These local improvements must relate to energy efficiency or renewable energy technology. The municipality must enter into an agreement with the property owner. A municipality may adopt a community-wide program for these types of improvements, or may consider individual improvements or a series of improvements on a case-by-case basis. Once the project is complete, the local improvement charge must recover the full cost of the financing provided by the municipality, and municipalities must report as directed by myself, the Minister of MACA. Mr. Chair, these long-awaited amendments respond to direct requests from community governments, meet MACA's stated goal of supporting community governments in carrying out municipal responsibilities, and to fulfill a mandate commitment for this Assembly. In proposing these amendments, MACA has consulted with community governments and other stakeholders and has worked closely with the Departments of Finance and Industry, Tourism, and Investment. Although not all tax-based communities intend to pursue these opportunities immediately, all agreed that they supported the option being available to the community governments should they choose to use it. Should these amendments gain the approval of the Legislative Assembly, they will come into force upon assent. Thank you, Mr. Chair. This concludes my opening remarks. I do look forward to hearing comments and answering any questions that members of committee may have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Does committee have any general comments or questions before we begin the clause-by-clause review? Okay, hearing none from committee, there's just a few issues that we've been grappling with as a committee in our review of the bill. There's been a concern from some of the stakeholders we engaged around the administrative complexity of managing the list of exemptions. Minister, you spoke to the exemptions in your opening comments, but again, the list is section 5 of the bill, and it's an accommodation that is remunerated for more than 30 continuous days, the daily accommodation rate that is less than $20 per night, or if the subject of the tax is the GNWT, a public agency or other reporting body as defined in subsection 1, brackets 1 of the Financial Administration Act, and a person or his or her family being accommodated as a result of medical travel, person staying in a hospital or healthcare facility, and then any other class of prescribed persons or bodies. And the regulations do allow the minister to make other exemptions based on classes of persons or bodies. So given that this is a rather large list of exemptions for what appears to be a simple, relatively simple tax, can you speak to any work the department's done to address this concern we've heard from the public around administrative complexity of managing the exemptions? Mr. Minister.
I'll just give you a little update on that section itself. This subsection contains the required exemptions. If you look at paragraphs A and B, but they're pretty well standard in much of the legislation across the country, and make this tax applicable to only short-term stays. The exemptions for medical travel and those staying at the healthcare facilities also appear in other pieces of legislation. The exemption for the GNWT appears to be unique. I know there was some concerns, as you had mentioned. By choosing to delegate this authority to municipal corporations, the GNWT is foregoing a revenue stream as well. The Department of Finance communicated clearly with MACA, and the GNWT will not choose to tax itself when it's not collecting revenue to offset those costs. Maybe I'll go to our law clerk, Mr. Ian Rennie, for any further detail in that subsection. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Mr. Rennie.
Well, I'm actually the Legislative Council.
Sorry.
I think MACA might have done some research on this, so perhaps could pass it over to, with your permission. I'm probably not the best person to speak to it.
Who would like to respond? Ms. Lauer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have heard the concerns of the administrative burden on administering this hotel accommodation tax. However, much of the administration may be at the direct authority of the municipality and how they design the tourist accommodation levy and what their reporting requirements are. As well, the exemptions may not be any dissimilar than the goods and services tax, which the GNWT also has an exemption on, and that kind of rebate mechanism.
Okay, thank you for that. I was going to ask about the impacts on revenues, but I think the minister has canvassed that issue. Are there any other questions for the minister? Mr. Van Thyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the department for their considerable work on the amendments and moving this legislation forward, as well as to the standing committee and their efforts. I think this has come a long way, a long time in the waiting. But to that section 5, and in particular the C1 through C5, I can share some appreciation, I guess, with identifying these exemptions, and I appreciate that there's been some work put into them. And I know we talk about the administrative part, we're talking about how one might be able to claim their rebate or what have you, but what about the initial burden of proof when somebody goes to a hotelier or a temporary accommodation? And how is it that the hotelier or the accommodation provider is expected to identify or prove that any one of these individuals who say they're here for this form of travel, where will the burden of proof lie? Will that be with the hotelier, or will the individuals have to make their claim to the municipality later? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Lau? Oh, sorry. Fife? Fife. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. When we looked at these clauses, when a GNWT employee is on travel, they're using a GNWT credit card with a GST exempt, which has to be submitted to a hotel when you're traveling. When individuals are on medical travel, the medical travel team of the GNWT books that travel. So again, they're booking it, and it's predetermined when the reservation is made. So the information is given up front on both of those instances. So that would be one way that the hotels would not have to try to distinguish one versus the other. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Van Thyn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think that knocks off almost all of those there, except for the one that would be outstanding is a public agency and or other reporting body as defined in subsection of the Financial Administration Act. Can we get a little bit more clarification on what exactly are we talking about relevant to public agencies, and then how would they also provide for a burden of proof? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Van Thyn. Ms. Fife again? Ms. Lau?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When we talk about public agencies that are identified within the Financial Administration Act, that incorporates the, and I don't have the comprehensive list on me, I'm afraid, but that incorporates other corporations such as a housing corporation. Those types of travel will also be determined in advance through identification of employment and through a government credit card as well.
Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Has the department done any kind of analysis of what proportion of hotel occupancy in Yellowknife is related to the exemptions identified in subsection 5 here? Thanks, Mr. Chair. And I guess where I'm going with this, what is the lost revenue stream? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd have to go to one of my staff for the detail on that. As I mentioned, we did make these amendments to address some of the, not the concerns, but the initiative that some of the municipalities wanted to take on in terms of putting this through. Grace, do you want to take this one? Or Lori?
Ms. Lau?
And I'll go to Ms. Lau, please. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. There has been some very high-level financial analysis. However, the baseline data for the types of travel it really isn't available reliably at this point in time. I believe that while we know the number of hotel rooms and/or accommodations within, for example, the city of Yellowknife, we don't have enough information on to determine what kind of travel was GNWT related, what kind of travel was medical, and what kind was out of territory tourism. So that amount of financial analysis on a high level, we might have some estimates, but they're not really anything that we've determined reliably yet.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
I guess if we don't have that data, does the department intend to try to find or collect that data or get a sense of that data in the future so we understand how this is being implemented and rolled out in some way? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and yes, we can commit to trying to get that information. As you've heard from Ms. Lau, that trying to break down to medical travel, GNWT travel, other types of corporations will take some time, but we can commit to seeing that type of work and working with the municipalities that are looking at implementing this and sharing that information and collecting that information. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Anything further, Mr. O'Reilly?
Yeah, thanks. I think my last one is, there's some regulation-making authority set out in the last part of the bill. Does the department believe, well, yeah, maybe it's a two-part question. Does the department intend to create any regulations? And are those regulations necessary for this to be implemented right away? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At this time, we're not looking at it, doing any regulations. It's really early on in the stages. And as we put it through the first year, then we'll be looking at what is needed and anything that we can add in terms of any types of regulations to this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly? In conclusion?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, that was the first part of my question. So the department's of the view then that there's no remaining residual barriers to a local government beginning to implement this right away.
Mr. Minister?
Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, like with any new piece of legislation, you might run into some concerns. Just reality. This is something that we will continue to work and support with any municipalities that are going to look at implementing it. What we have here is a lot of consultation, a lot of engagements with our community governments as well as stakeholders, and that's where we have come to this piece of legislation. But as any piece of legislation, we'll be monitoring as it's being implemented. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Before we go to the next committee member, we received submission from the Days Inn. Yellowknife Days Inn, yes, and they have done some calculations. So based on their calculations, a 3% accommodation levy per per room night would be $4.27. At 71.7% occupancy, the potential annual collection will be around $1.173 million. And again, looking at the numbers, they estimate that exclusions would dilute the annual levy collection by as much as 39%. So, Mr. Minister, do those numbers sound reasonable based on what your department understands of accommodations in the city of Yellowknife and the rates that hoteliers are applying to rooms, Mr. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And recently I just read in the news somewhere that we are experiencing one of our highest tourism, I wouldn't say seasons, but highest tourism in the NWT ever, specifically here in Yellowknife. So yes, those numbers do sound reasonable.
Do you further, like the 39% exclusion the exemptions that amount to 39% of potential revenues? That's probably the number we're more interested in on the committee. Mr. Minister, can you speak to that?
I'd have to get more detail and then have to get back to members. Like I said, this is really early on in days, but we'd still have to look at GNWT employees. I mean, if that's, the hotel had done all the research, looked at the GNWT exemptions, medical travel. We still got to do all that work right across the city.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Mr. McNeely?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you explain a little bit more detail? I know the responses given to my colleague here from the YK North, Ms. Van Tyne here, on the traffic people coming. I'm thinking about the average family coming to Yellowknife for their Christmas shopping coming up here, and the Satu SSI land claim board members coming here. Are these individuals going to be exempt? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Minister?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the member, but the way this legislation reads at this time, no.
Mr. McNeely?
Yeah, well, given it's going to be presented that way, I really feel for these smaller communities and the already high operating costs that they have to live within. And, you know, this levy, along with a carbon tax, the average John Doe downtown Fort Good Hope would say, how much more taxes are we going to be imposed on? And in this case, somebody else is going to benefit from the $4 or the $40 or the 3%. If you put it on a expanded revenue sales for the whole territories outside of the days in assumptions, and we do our survey. So using the survey's number provided by the spectacular survey numbers, you're looking at, you know, in a neighborhood of $3 million point some dollars coming into the Northwest Territories. And given the fact, you know, we can all do assumptions, but, you know, these assumptions are sizable enough to say, why are we paying for somebody else's growth? Like, if I was a leader from Good Hope, I'd say, listen, you have sales, tourism sales in the neighborhood based on the survey. And these are only expectations. 200 million. And the traffic coming into the whole Northwest Territories, whether it's down at Dempster Highway or landing at the Yellowknife Airport from the direct flight from Vancouver, you're looking at 108,000 visitors. So if you less a comfort zone to give you comfort that these are the actual numbers going into the city of Yellowknife, who's going to be a large benefactor to this levy, and you say, okay, well, I'm gonna reduce that by 40% to give me some comfort zone. Even given that comfort zone, you're looking at in the neighborhood of $1.52 million coming to this community. And if I'm a leader from Fort Good Hope, I'd say, I don't mind the tourism levy. I enjoy it, and I see the value that it's going to create for energy improvements, as well as the maybe even the thought of building a new tourism facility center, similar to the facility in the Yukon, which I understand is very attractive. So why am I imposing on my people in Fort Good Hope for a levy? I would really strongly recommend exempting the Northwest Territories residents. There's enough to go around. There's enough in the numbers to justify a lucrative income, and probably the only cost associated with collecting that would be a bookkeeper behind a desk. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. Minister, more of a comment, but I'll allow you the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of things there. If you look at subparagraph 5C, bracket C, brackets V, it does allow for further exemptions to be prescribed by the regulation. Also, when we were looking at it, an exemption for all NWT residents was the focus of the department's research that was completed in January and February of 2018. It also included an analysis of the legality of such an exemption. A legal opinion found that although it's not automatically illegal or unconstitutional, the exemption of NWT residents from the tax does create the possibility for a challenge under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So that was one of the reasons why we didn't look at that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Okay, short supplementary to that, Mr. McNeely.
No, I can speak all I want. I figure I don't have to put limitations or somebody put limitations on me to speak here when previous speakers already had 2 or 3 or half a dozen responses. So I just say that for the record. To get into detail, I think we all agree with this level. And as I mentioned earlier, if you do the math and you say, okay, you've got tourism sales, 200 million, 180,000 traffic members, let's just pick a number and say, okay, the average stay of the tourists, 7 nights, average charge per room, $200. So you're looking at over $300 million if you do the math there. 3% of that, not 4, 3. So I think that's why I say it's comforting enough to know, once you know the details of how the expectations of this legislation is going to be ruled out in favor of the stakeholders, then you can feel comfortable to say, okay, how can we tweak that to design and exempt the other residents that just want to come to Yellowknife to take their families on a shopping tour or to do business with their land claim initiatives, which are benefiting both the city as well as the government on their principles of the agenda that they decide to come. Otherwise, they'll say, okay, well, you come here to Delaney. So I just point that out again there to give it some more thought there if you want to do the math, and I think it's quite a sales levy in order to take and give strong consideration to people that really aren't creating that sales. And even if they were exempt, it'll still be a nice cash cow there for some new facilities and improved homes here in the city. Thank you.
Mr. Minister.
Thank you, and take it more of as a comment, but I'll go back to the exclusions section. And as I mentioned, brackets 5, brackets C, brackets V does allow for further exemptions to be prescribed by regulation. And that's an option moving forward, but take the members' concerns and comments. Thank you.
Mr. McNeely, anything further?
Yeah, I'd rather settle for legislation than the regulations. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Van Thyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm going to jump off the accommodation levy part for just a moment and maybe move over to the local improvement charge opportunity that's going to result in energy efficient and energy retrofit programs for these 6 municipalities. In drafting the legislation, and I know that different municipalities have ways in which to measure and gauge the qualifying the benefits of an energy retrofit program. I was involved, of course, with the City of Yellowknife when we enacted the EnerGuide 80 standards. But there's been some recent challenges around that. And so I'm just wondering what the government's expectation is in meeting our own energy strategy as well as our greenhouse, climate change strategic framework, what the expectations would be for a energy retrofit or energy We're terming them as energy efficiency works or renewable energy works. How will they be, how do we expect the municipalities to qualify qualify what is actually gonna be consisting of a program of an energy efficiency? Like, how do we identify an energy efficiency program? And then how do we identify if the investment actually resulted in a benefit at the end of the day? What tool are we expecting that would be used? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Obviously, we would work with the municipality to, we have our own strategies, as you know, here within the government. We have some NGOs that do a lot of work in energy retrofits and energy initiatives, but we definitely work with the municipality to help them and assist them with what we're doing as a government in our strategy and have those open discussions.
Mr. Van Thuyne.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I appreciate that we would have to work with them, but I would want to make sure, and we do indicate in that in section 6, it also refers to paragraph 4B, and paragraph 4B, if you bear with me, states that the undertaking of energy efficiency works or renewable energy works which satisfy the requirements of a program of the municipal corporation. You know, are we sure that, you know, are these yet to be designed and developed, or is there, and if they aren't, what kind of expectation, again, I guess, are we requiring that these programs or policies meet in order to make sure that energy retrofits, energy efficient renovations are being met at the end of the day? Thank you.
Mr. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This subsection actually gives the municipality corporation the flexibility to either institute an entire program that they want, let's say here for the city of Yellowknife, that they want to implement, or to deal with it on a case-by-case basis. So it actually gives them the flexibility to do that work. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Nakamaiak.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just getting back to my colleague, Mr. McNeely, about exemptions. I know this doesn't really affect the communities I live in, but Inuvik is the Center for the Inuvik Regional Corporation, which I'm part of that self-government, and Mr. McNeely mentioned and governments and beneficiaries of government. Looking at the events with marijuana and the choice for the Inuvik not to move forward with that, I think when you look at this bill, you need to keep in mind that we are part of land claims organizations and beneficiaries as well too. I think it might be a good idea for the department to look into that more deeply, to understand that it seems to be like money is coming on one side, but when it's time to balance a little bit, I think we need to keep in mind that those exemptions might be appropriate for what Mr. McNeely's asking, and myself as well too. In the last couple of years, when the Inuvik Regional Corporation was deemed a self-government, we had reimbursements in the millions of dollars, maybe likely from the GNWT, and I know definitely from the Government of Canada, on the goods and services tax that we've been paying throughout all of these years. So it might be good to dust up, we can provide you with information like that declares us a government. So I just want to know what the minister had to say about that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At the time of the initial review, as I mentioned, there was no issues being raised with exemptions. We're hearing it now, and I know you guys went out and did your consultations. It's really up to the municipality. I mentioned there's 6 of them that have the opportunity to put this in place if they're going to be doing the levy tax. And from my understanding in Inuvik, it's not going to happen. But reference back again to the exclusions, it does allow for further exemptions to be prescribed by regulation. But from my understanding right now, I think there's only one municipality that might be looking at implementing this. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Neckmeyer?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just propose maybe the next steps, getting back to the self-governments. That might be a good step for the department to look back into with some potential numbers. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And from the onset of this piece of legislation, the department has done a lot of engagements, met with a lot of stakeholders, and got support, met with other, our partners to bring this forward. And we did get support. But as the chair has mentioned that in some of your consultations, you've heard of the concerns. So thank you. Take it as a comment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Anything further, Mr. Neckmeyer?
No, nothing opposed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Neckmeyer. Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, let's get back to the levy. It's a tourism tax, or levy. Okay, so to me, the exemption should be for all NWT residents. We see the exemption for medical travel and GNWT businesses or business and that. Well, when we looked at the airport tax, the government wasn't exempt from that. They paid that tax. So why isn't the government paying that? Why is it all of a sudden it's that important, a 4% tax or levy is more important than the airport tax? Because I mean, or the airport levy, because that's huge. When we talk about medical travel, we're talking thousands of dollars. And so why are we all of a sudden medical travel being an issue to be exempt? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Minister?
Thank you, Ms. Speaker. Maybe I'll go to Ms. Lau to answer that question. Thank you.
Ms. Lawa?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In terms of the airport tax, the GWT collects that airport revenue, and they have an offsetting revenue to pay for that tax on GWT business. In terms of the tourism accommodation tax, that would be paid to for use from the municipality, and the GWT won't have any offsetting revenue to pay for GNWT tax, a business. So while the GNWT is making this amendment to allow the municipalities to impose this tax, we're also foregoing our own revenue in this manner. So that's why the GNWT has been listed as exempt.
Thank you, Ms. Lawa. Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank Ms. Law for that answer. I guess I'm still struggling, because that airport tax is for the Yellowknife, the airport of Yellowknife. Let's be honest, it's Yellowknife. Okay? So that money coming in, it's being taken from the government's coffers. Yeah, they're moving it from Paul to pay Peter, but it's actually paying for the infrastructure of the airport. So to me, if we're looking at exemptions, I don't see why medical travel and that should be there. So that is the concern. But my other concern is when we look at this, these major centers are where people, sporting groups come. So now you're putting this extra cost on these sporting groups to fundraise for this. You know, we're talking about small communities that are trying to travel into the 6 centers, and if the 6 centers tap into this, because this is what the legislation says. So what I would like to see is just an exemption for NWT residents. So if they have a card, whether it's their health care card, their driver's license, they're exempt, done. If we're trying to tap into the tourism industry, I think this is a perfect opportunity to do it. But if you're asking, you know, everybody else to pay for it, but we're going to exempt medical travel, so we're going to exempt the government, but we're still going to punish the residents of the Northwest Territories with this. So what I'm asking and I'm recommending is we exempt the NWT residents, then it's not a burden on the hotels. They ask for it, here it is, they have the ID. If they don't have the ID, then they have to come back and justify it later on. But everybody has a healthcare card. Everybody should have some form of ID, which is NWT. So I have a problem with the list of the exemptions, but if we just go to the NWT residents, I think then that addresses it, and if we just put a levy on tourists, that's who we're trying to get the industry from, then that's the good way of doing it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Minister.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I think earlier when one of the members had mentioned it, I talked about the exemption of all NWT residents and the possibility for a challenge under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and that could cause a little bit more concern moving forward. To some of the specialty groups, specifically youth and sport, if you look at further to the other contents of bylaw, just after the exclusions in bracket 6, bracket 8, there's also exemptions from the tax, and municipalities can look at doing something. As I also mentioned, it's not all 6 communities that I mentioned in my opening comments are going to be looking at implementing this, and we will be taking a look at it as we working with the municipal corporations to monitor and evaluate as we go along. Thank you.
Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I understand what the minister is saying, but we're making it the communities that make a decision. Like it's, okay, we're downloading to the community so they can make the exemption. So now all of a sudden, they could have a long list of exemptions. What I'm saying is the northern residents, is there? To me, that there is the avenue. And when the minister talks about the fact that it may or may not, or, you know, it's open to the 6, but right now it's just Yellowknife. Well, I know if it works well here in Yellowknife, the other tax-based communities are gonna start looking at it. So, as us being proactive and addressing it now, then it's still that opportunity. But I can see some of the bigger centers, Hay River, Nuvik, and Fort Smith, later on tapping into this. So, again, I'm trying to fix this bill so that when the future happens, that it's already there, it's already in place. And that, to me, is being proactive and not instead of be reactionary. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And from my recollection and understanding, initially, these amendments that were brought forward to update the act, you know, was pushed on by one municipality in particular. We had support from other organizations. I know some of the other regional centers and municipal corporations didn't want to look at it, but wanted to support it for the revenue that would be generated for what is outlined in the in this piece of legislation. So initially on the onset, other municipalities weren't really looking into this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Mr. Thompson, anything further?
Just one final comment. I realize it was one municipality that brought it forth, but the other 5 municipalities supported it. And when they support that, that gives them the opportunity. So I'd like to thank Yellowknife, the city of Yellowknife, for stepping forward and doing this. You know, it's a positive direction. They're trying to help promote tourism. They're trying to get that, because that's the economy that we're going to be seeing in the future. Tourism is going to be the next diamond mine. And we're going to see that better, bigger and better. So I thank the city of Yellowknife for doing that. And I also thank the other tax-based communities for stepping up and supporting it, because that gives them the opportunity later on to do it, should they wish. So again, I understand it started here, but it's globally. It's going to have an effect on the whole territories. And so, I mean, I just want to make sure that's clear, that I'm not opposing this. I'm just saying it should be what it's there for. It's for the tourism industry. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Minister, anything to add?
I'll take it as a comment.
Mr. McNeely?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, there's all sorts of variables that could happen after assent. You know, I agree with my other previous speakers here, and like I had mentioned earlier, I agree with the principle of the levy. And, you know, there's really no incentive for the municipality of Norman Wells to charge a levy on 2 or 3 people that are coming into that tourist community. It's a small group of people that do come from outside the territories, mostly into the mountains for the big game hunting. So you're really talking about a traffic that is not justifiable to the town to charge. So understandably so. And given that lack of motivation to charge the 2 hotels or the 3 hotels that are in Norman Wells for this extra administration duty income, they're probably gonna say, no, I'm not interested, I'll decline on this legislative opportunity. And I know it's really coming from the heaviest traffic municipal of all 33 communities, is Yellowknife. Now, the outside communities, and as my previous colleague had mentioned, it might be cheaper for Sports North to say, okay, well, no, let's go and meet and have our track meet in Hay River. They've got the facilities there, and we're gonna save X amount of dollars. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out how much money you should set aside for this levy if you come to Yellowknife from the Sport North activity. Or let's go to Inuvik. Or, and that means lost revenue for the city. And it might, the land corporation groups might say, okay, well, let's gather together and let's try to waive this levy by having an arrangement with one of the hotels. And the hotel owner says, yes, I totally agree, I'll give you an exemption. And that creates, in some people's view, uncompetitive fairness with the other owners. So you've got these created friction between stakeholders. So those are just other factors to consider. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. McNeely, Mr. Minister.
Thank you, and we'll take as other factors into consideration. I do know that there are groups out there right now that have partnerships with certain hotel groups, so it's already happening. I mean, so just thanks for the comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Mr. McNeely.
Nothing, thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Seeing no one else on my list, I just wanted to offer a few points that have been raised. So committee's understanding that the NWT Association of Communities was also in support of these changes, which represents more than just the 6 tax-based centers. We have received concerns from the city of Yellowknife, who's primarily the beneficiary of these changes, that they would prefer that Bill 18 did not contain such an exhaustive list of exclusions. So that that concern has been raised and shared with committee. And no, that was my list. So I just wanted to telegraph those for both yourself and the general public. Seeing nothing further, we will move into the clause-by-clause review. Thank you very much for your questions, committee, and for your responses, Mr. Minister. Does committee agree to conduct a clause-by-clause review of Bill 18 and act to amend the Cities, Towns, and Villages Act? Thank you, committee. We'll defer the title of the bill until the end and begin with consideration of the clauses. There are 7 clauses in this bill. Please turn to page 1. To clause 1. Clause 2. Clause, Mr. Simpson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Clause 2 of Bill 18 be amended by deleting proposed subclause 70.15 and substituting the following. 5, a tourist accommodation tax must not be imposed under this section if the subject of the tax is a resident of the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Motion is in order. To the motion, Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This amendment would remove the myriad of exemptions for different classes of persons who would be subject to the accommodation levy. The reasons for this amendment have been well canvassed, and they are twofold. The first is to ensure that the levy targets tourists but does not affect residents, municipal and indigenous governments, youth sports teams, and NWT-based NGOs and small businesses who much of the time must travel to the capital because this is where government services are centralized. The amendment would exempt residents of the NWT regardless of whether they are traveling for work, personal reasons, medical reasons, and so on. The second is to ease the potential administrative burden that could be put on accommodation providers depending on how municipalities implement the levy. And as the minister stated, this does not appear to violate the Charter of Rights, and so I'm confident moving this motion.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. To the motion?
Question.
Mr. O'Reilly, as you're not a member of the committee, I won't allow you to speak to the motion because it is a voting matter. Any committee member wish to speak to the motion? To the motion? Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment? Mr. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At this time, I cannot concur with the motion. As I had mentioned, we've worked closely with community governments on the onset of this piece of legislation to change any provisions of the bill in this manner at this late stage of the game. Without their involvement does not align with our typical process on engagement and consultations. I do believe I've also answered this question on a couple of occasions with, from other questions from other members, so no, I cannot concur at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. As a result of the minister not concurring, the amendment is defeated. Committee to Clause 2. Does committee agree? Okay, moving on to Clause 3. Clause 4. Clause 5. Clause 6. Clause 7. Thank you, committee. Those are all the clauses of the bill. We'll now return to bill number and title. Bill 18, an act to amend the Cities, Towns, and Villages Act. Does the committee agree? Thank you, committee. Does committee agree that Bill 18, an act to amend the City, Towns, and Villages Act, is now ready for consideration in committee of the whole? Mr. Simpson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Bill 18, an act to amend the Cities, Towns, and Villages Act, be reported to the Assembly as ready for consideration in committee of the whole.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. The motion's in order. The motion's on the floor to the motion.
Question.
Question has been called. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion is carried. Bill 18, an act to amend the Cities, Towns, and Villages Act, will be reported to the Assembly as ready for consideration in committee of the whole. Thank you, Mr. Minister. Thank you to your officials. Thank you to members of the public who joined us today. We are now adjourned, committee.